The first-class cabin of Delta Flight 447 buzzed with quiet conversations and the gentle hum of expensive electronics. Passengers settled into their leather seats, adjusting personal air vents and requesting champagne from flight attendants who moved with practiced grace. The atmosphere was one of controlled luxury, where money bought silence and comfort in equal measure. In seat 2A, 22-year-old Isabella pressed her face against the oval window, watching ground crews load luggage beneath the aircraft. Her designer handbag sat unopened beside her, containing enough cash to buy a small house, yet she felt emptier than she had ever felt in her privileged life. The weight of recent events pressed down on her chest like a physical force, making each breath feel labored and insufficient. Isabella had grown up in a world where problems were solved with phone calls and checkbooks. Her father owned a technology empire worth $47 billion. Their family compound and vineyard sprawled across 200 acres, complete with a private beach, helicopter pad, and staff quarters housing 36 employees. She had never known want, never experienced the anxiety of unpaid bills or empty refrigerators, never had to choose between necessities because money was scarce. But money, she was learning, could not fix everything. 3 rows behind Isabella, in seat 5C, Washington adjusted her worn but clean jacket and checked on her 7-year-old son, who was coloring quietly in the seat beside her. Had saved for 18 months to afford these coach seats, working double shifts at the community hospital where she served as a registered nurse. The flight to Los Angeles represented more than transportation. It was hope wrapped in aluminum and jet fuel, carrying them toward a new life far from the violence and desperation that had claimed too many of their neighbors. Her son clutched a small action figure that had seen better days. The paint was chipped, one arm was slightly loose, but the child treasured it because it had belonged to his father, killed in Afghanistan when was barely 3 years old. Often caught her son talking to the figure, creating elaborate adventures where his daddy was the hero who always came home safe. The contrast between the 2 passengers could not have been starker. Isabella wore a silk blouse that cost more than made in a month. Her shoes were handcrafted Italian leather, her jewelry genuine diamonds set in platinum. Everything about her spoke of unlimited resources and careful cultivation. His clothing was practical and modest, chosen for durability rather than fashion, clean and well-maintained, but clearly purchased at discount stores. As the plane prepared for departure, Isabella's phone vibrated with another message from her father. She glanced at the screen and immediately felt her stomach clench. The text was brief, as all his communications were, but loaded with disappointment that cut deeper than any shouting match could have. Board meeting moved to Thursday. Your presence required. No excuses this time. We will discuss your behavior when you return. Isabella deleted the message without responding, just as she had deleted the 17 previous messages he had sent since yesterday morning. She knew what discuss your behavior meant in the family vocabulary. It meant a formal sitting in his oak-paneled office, with her mother present as a silent witness, while outlined exactly how Isabella had failed to meet the family's expectations once again. The source of his current displeasure was hardly scandalous by normal standards. Isabella had been photographed at a charity gala, not drunk or inappropriately dressed, but standing next to Tommy, the son of a rival technology company's founder. The photo had appeared in 3 business journals and 2 society magazines, generating speculation about a possible romantic relationship that might lead to a business alliance between the families. The problem was that Isabella genuinely liked Tommy. He made her laugh, treated her like a person rather than a business opportunity, and seemed interested in her thoughts about books and music rather than her father's stock portfolio. For the first time in her adult life, she had met someone who appeared to value her company for reasons that had nothing to do with corporate mergers or social climbing, but saw only threat and opportunity. The family represented competition in 3 key market sectors, and any personal relationship between the families could complicate carefully planned business strategies. When Isabella refused to promise she would stop seeing Tommy, her father's response had been swift and decisive. You will terminate this association immediately, or I will ensure that young Mr. understands the consequences of pursuing a relationship that could damage both our family's interests. The implied threat was clear, possessed enough influence to destroy careers, tank stock prices, and ruin reputations with a few strategic phone calls. Isabella had seen him do it before to business rivals who had overstepped boundaries he considered sacred. The thought of Tommy becoming collateral damage in her father's corporate warfare made her physically sick. So she had run, boarding the first available flight to Los Angeles without telling anyone her destination or plans. It was a childish response, she knew, but it was the only form of rebellion available to someone whose entire life was monitored and managed by a team of assistants, bodyguards, and family advisors. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Isabella felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. The weight of her situation pressed down on her with increasing force. She was trapped between her genuine feelings for someone who treated her with kindness and respect, and her family's expectations that she would subordinate her personal happiness to corporate strategy. The tears came slowly at first, then more rapidly as the full scope of her dilemma became clear. She was crying not just for Tommy, but for the realization that her entire life had been choreographed by others. Her education at exclusive private schools, her summer internships at carefully selected companies, her social circle of approved friends from appropriate families, everything had been designed to prepare her for a role she had never chosen for herself. Washington noticed the crying almost immediately. As a nurse, she was trained to observe people in distress, and the young woman 3 rows ahead was clearly struggling with something serious. The crying was not dramatic or attention-seeking, but steady and heartbroken, the kind of tears that came from deep emotional pain rather than momentary frustration. At first, hesitated to interfere. The first-class section might as well have been another planet from her world, populated by people whose problems were presumably too complex and expensive for simple human comfort to address. But as the crying continued, growing more intense rather than subsiding, her nursing instincts and natural compassion overrode her awareness of social boundaries. The flight attendants were busy with beverage service and safety announcements, and other first-class passengers seemed determined to ignore the distress happening in their midst. Some had put on noise-canceling headphones, others had raised newspapers or opened laptops to create barriers between themselves and the emotional scene unfolding nearby. Understood this response. Wealthy people, in her experience, often seemed uncomfortable with raw human emotion, preferring to address problems through intermediaries and formal processes rather than direct human connection. But she also understood that pain was universal, and that sometimes what someone needed most was simply to know that another person cared enough to notice their suffering. Young looked up from his coloring book and tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mama, why is that lady crying?" he whispered, his voice filled with the genuine concern that children often showed for others in distress. Looked at her son, then at the crying young woman, and made a decision that would change both their lives in ways she could never have anticipated. "Sometimes people get sad, baby," she told quietly, "and sometimes the right thing to do is see if we can help them feel a little better." She unbuckled her and stood up, smoothing down her jacket and checking to make sure was settled safely in his seat. The action drew curious glances from other passengers, but had never been particularly concerned with what strangers thought of her behavior when someone was obviously in need of help. Walking up the aisle toward first class, felt acutely aware of the invisible barriers she was crossing. Her presence in the premium section would likely be questioned by flight attendants, and the crying young woman might not welcome intervention from a stranger, especially one who so obviously came from a different social and economic background. But as she got closer, she could see that the young woman's distress was genuine and profound. This was not the tears of someone who had broken a nail or missed a shopping appointment. This was the crying of someone whose heart was breaking, and professional and personal experience told her that such pain required human connection rather than expensive solutions. Isabella was so lost in her own misery that she didn't notice the approaching figure until a gentle voice spoke near her ear. "Excuse me, sweetheart, I couldn't help but notice you're upset. Is there anything I can do to help?" Isabella looked up through tear-blurred eyes to see a woman about her mother's age standing in the aisle beside her seat. The woman was black, clearly not first-class passenger based on her clothing and the direction she had come from, but her eyes held genuine warmth and concern that Isabella had rarely encountered in her privileged world. For a moment, Isabella was too surprised to respond. In her experience, strangers did not approach her with offers of help unless they wanted something: an introduction to her father, a business opportunity, or simply the social currency that came from association with the name. But this woman's expression held no hint of calculation or hidden agenda. She simply looked like someone who had seen another person in pain and wanted to offer comfort. "I'm sorry," Isabella managed to say through her tears. "I don't mean to disturb anyone. I'll be quiet." His heart ached at the response. The young woman's first instinct was to apologize for her pain, to promise to hide her distress so others wouldn't be inconvenienced. It spoke to a lifetime of being taught that her emotions were less important than other people's comfort. A lesson had seen damage too many people over the years. "Oh, honey, you're not disturbing anyone," said gently. "And you don't need to apologize for feeling sad. Sometimes we all need to cry, and there's nothing wrong with that." The kindness in her voice triggered a fresh wave of tears from Isabella. When was the last time someone had given her permission to feel upset without immediately trying to fix the problem or explain why she shouldn't be emotional about it? Her family's approach to her distress was usually to present logical arguments about why her feelings were inappropriate or counterproductive, followed by detailed plans to address whatever situation had caused the upset. But this stranger, this woman who had no reason to care about Isabella's problems, was offering something much more valuable than solutions. She was offering acceptance of Isabella's right to feel whatever she was feeling, without judgment or attempts to minimize her pain. The woman said, settling into the empty seat beside Isabella without asking permission. "And you look like someone who could use a friend right about now." Isabella stared at this unexpected kindness, struggling to process the simple human generosity being offered to her. In her world, friendship was strategic, alliances were calculated, and genuine care was so rare that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to receive it. "I'm Isabella," she whispered, and then, because presence felt safe in a way nothing had felt safe in months, she added, "And I think I've made a terrible mess of my life." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest in a way that Isabella had not spoken to another person in years. But instead of the judgment or advice she expected, simply nodded with understanding. "Well then," said with a slight smile, "it sounds like you've come to the right person. I've made my share of messes over the years, and I've learned a thing or two about cleaning them up." The conversation between Isabella and began slowly, with careful exchanges about safe topics like the weather and flight destinations. But as the aircraft settled into its cruising altitude and the cabin lights dimmed slightly, something shifted in the atmosphere between them. Perhaps it was the enclosed space, or the way strangers often found themselves sharing intimate details during travel. But Isabella found herself opening up too in ways that surprised them both. "I've never really had friends," Isabella admitted, staring down at her hands. "I mean, I have people I go to parties with, people from the same social circle, but I don't think any of them actually know me. And I'm starting to realize I don't know myself either." Listened without interrupting, recognizing the careful way Isabella chose her words, as if she had spent her entire life being monitored and judged for every statement she made. It reminded of patients in the hospital who had been taught that expressing pain or need was somehow shameful, that suffering in silence was more admirable than asking for help. "What do you mean when you say you don't know yourself?" asked gently. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, watching clouds drift past the airplane window. The question seemed simple, but it touched on something she had been struggling with for months without being able to articulate clearly. "I know what I'm supposed to want," Isabella said finally. "I'm supposed to want to join the family business, marry someone who will strengthen our corporate relationships, have children who will carry on the legacy. I'm supposed to want influence and power and respect in business circles. But when I try to imagine actually living that life, I feel like I can't breathe." She turned to look at, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. "Is it normal to feel trapped by the life everyone else thinks you should be grateful for?" The question hit with unexpected force. She thought about her own life, the choices she had made and the ones that had been made for her. Growing up in a working-class family in Detroit, she had faced entirely different pressures than Isabella, but the essential conflict was surprisingly similar. Society had clear expectations for what a young black woman from her neighborhood should want and accept from life, and those expectations had often felt just as confining as Isabella's golden cage. "I think," said carefully, "that feeling trapped by other people's expectations is one of the most common human experiences there is. The difference is that some cages are made of gold and some are made of necessity, but they're all still cages." Isabella studied his face, searching for signs of judgment or dismissal. She was accustomed to people rolling their eyes when she expressed dissatisfaction with her privileged circumstances, as if having money meant she was not allowed to struggle with questions of purpose or authenticity. But expression remained open and understanding. "Can I ask you something?" Isabella said hesitantly. "Of course. How do you know when you're making the right choice? When you're living your own life instead of just following someone else's script?" Smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "That's a question I'm still figuring out myself, sweetheart. But I can tell you that the first step is usually the hardest one, admitting that the script might not be right for you." She gestured toward the back of the plane, where her son was visible reading a picture book that the flight attendant had given him. "When my husband died, I had to make a choice. I could stay in Detroit, close to family who would help me raise, follow the path that everyone expected for a young widow. Or I could take a job in Los Angeles that scared me to death, but offered opportunities I'd never dreamed of for both of us." "What made you decide to move?" Isabella asked. "I realized that staying safe wasn't the same thing as doing right by my son," replied. "And I realized that my fear of making the wrong choice was keeping me from making any choice at all. Sometimes you have to jump before you know where you're going to land." Isabella absorbed this, thinking about her current situation. Running away to Los Angeles without a clear plan certainly qualified as jumping before knowing where she would land. But for the first time in months, she felt like she was making a decision for herself rather than reacting to her father's demands or society's expectations. "The man I told you about," Isabella said quietly. "The one who's causing all the trouble with my family. He's not appropriate according to my father's standards, but he's the first person I've met who seems to like me for who I am rather than what I represent." "Tell me about him," encouraged. Isabella's face softened as she thought about Tommy. "His name is Tommy. He's smart and funny, and he asks me questions about things I care about. He wants to know what I think about books I've read, places I've traveled, causes I believe in. When we talk, I feel like myself instead of like a representative of the family interests." She paused, then continued with growing emotion. "But my father sees him as a threat because his family's company competes with ours in certain markets. My father thinks I'm being naive and romantic, risking important business relationships for what he calls an infatuation." Noticed how Isabella's voice changed when she talked about Tommy. It became more animated, more authentically emotional than the carefully controlled tone she used when discussing her family obligations. "What do you think?" asked. "Do you believe you're being naive?" "I don't know," Isabella admitted. "I've never had to make this kind of choice before. I've never cared enough about someone to risk my father's disapproval. But the way Tommy treats me, the way he makes me feel about myself, it's the first time I've understood why people write songs about love, why they make choices that don't make sense on paper." She looked out the window again, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "My father threatened to ruin Tommy's career if I don't stop seeing him. And the terrible thing is, he has the power to do it. He could make a few phone calls and destroy everything Tommy has worked for just to prove a point about family loyalty." Felt a familiar anger rising in her chest. The same anger she felt when she saw patients whose families more concerned with appearances than with actual, or when she witnessed people in power using that power to control and manipulate others. But she kept her voice calm and supportive. "That must feel like an impossible situation," she said. "It is," Isabella replied, fresh tears beginning to form. "If I choose Tommy, I'm responsible for destroying his future. If I choose my family, I'm destroying my own chance at happiness. Either way, someone I care about gets hurt." Was quiet for a moment, thinking about the complexity of Isabella's dilemma. In her experience as a nurse, she had learned that some problems couldn't be solved, only navigated with as much wisdom and courage as possible. But she had also learned that people were often stronger than they believed themselves to be, capable of finding solutions that hadn't initially seemed possible. "Can I tell you something about your situation that might sound harsh?" asked gently. Isabella nodded, bracing herself for judgment. "I think you're framing this as a choice between two people, Tommy and your father. But I wonder if the real choice is between two different versions of yourself." Isabella looked puzzled, so continued. "One version of you accepts that your father has the right to control your personal relationships through threats and economic pressure. That version of you agrees that family business interests should determine who you're allowed to love. The other version of you believes that you have the right to make your own choices about your life, even if those choices come with costs and consequences. The words hung in the air between them, challenging Isabella to think about her situation from a completely different angle. She had been so focused on protecting Tommy and avoiding conflict with her father that she hadn't considered what her acquiescence to her father's demands would mean for her own sense of self and autonomy. "But if I choose to assert my independence, Tommy still gets hurt," Isabella protested. "Maybe," agreed, "but maybe not. You're assuming that your father's threats are the end of the story. But what if they're just the beginning? What if there are other options you haven't explored because you've been too scared to think beyond the immediate conflict?" Isabella considered this, realizing that her panic about the situation had indeed prevented her from thinking creatively about possible solutions. Her entire life had been spent within systems designed and controlled by her father, making it difficult to imagine alternatives that existed outside those systems. "I don't know how to fight someone with that much power," Isabella admitted. "You don't have to fight him," replied. "But you might have to stop letting him define the terms of engagement. Your father's power comes partly from your agreement to play by his rules. What happens if you refuse to play the game the way he set it up?" Before Isabella could respond, a small voice interrupted their conversation. "Mama, can I sit with you? The man next to me is snoring really loud." Isabella looked up to see son standing in the aisle, clutching his action figure and looking slightly overwhelmed by the adult environment around him. His presence immediately changed the dynamic of the conversation, introducing an element of innocence and simplicity that neither woman had expected. "Of course, baby," said, moving to make room for between herself and Isabella. "Isabella, this is my son. This is my new friend, Isabella." Studied Isabella with the frank curiosity that children brought to new encounters. He seemed unimpressed by her expensive clothing or first-class surroundings, focusing instead on her tear-streaked face with obvious concern. "Are you sad?" he asked directly. Isabella was taken aback by the child's straightforward question. Adults rarely asked her directly about her emotions, instead making assumptions or offering advice without first confirming what she was actually experiencing. "Yes," she said honestly, "I am sad." "What's making you sad?" continued, settling into his seat and arranging his action figure on his lap. Isabella glanced at, unsure how to explain adult relationship complications to a 7-year-old, but nodded encouragingly, curious to see how Isabella would handle the child's innocent inquiry. "I have to make a choice about something important," Isabella said carefully, "and all the choices seem like they might hurt someone I care about." Nodded gravely, as if this made perfect sense to him. "My daddy used to say that sometimes doing the right thing is hard, but that doesn't mean you don't do it." The simple wisdom of the child's statement hit Isabella with unexpected force. She looked at the action figure in his hands and realized it was battered and well-loved, clearly a precious possession rather than just another toy. "Is that your daddy's?" she asked gently. His face lit up with pride. "Yes, he was a soldier and he was really brave. Mama says he always tried to do the right thing, even when it was scary." Isabella felt something shift inside her chest as she looked at this child who had lost his father but still carried forward his father's values with such clear certainty. Here was someone who understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act according to your principles despite being afraid. Watch the interaction between Isabella and with growing recognition that something important was happening. Her son's presence had introduced a clarity to the conversation that adult complexity had been obscuring. Sometimes, she realized, children could cut through elaborate justifications and complicated reasoning to identify the essential truth of a situation. As the plane continued its journey westward, 3 people from vastly different circumstances found themselves connected by a conversation about courage, choice, and the price of living authentically. Isabella was beginning to understand that her choice was not really about Tommy or her father, but about what kind of person she wanted to be and what kind of life she wanted to create for herself. The conversation took an unexpected turn when, with the unfiltered honesty of childhood, asked Isabella why she was dressed so fancy if she was running away from home. The question made both women laugh despite the serious nature of their discussion, and Isabella found herself explaining to a 7-year-old that sometimes people dressed up not because they wanted to, but because they were expected to maintain certain appearances. "That sounds silly. declared, adjusting his action figure's pose. My daddy said you should dress for the job you want to do, not to make other people happy. Isabella looked at her expensive outfit with new eyes, realizing that every item she wore had been chosen to meet other people's expectations rather than her own preferences or comfort. Even in her moment of rebellion, running away from her father's demands, she was still conforming to the image others had created for her. Your daddy sounds like he was a very wise man, Isabella said too. He was, replied matter-of-factly. Mama says I'm going to be wise too when I grow up, but I have to learn how first. Reached over to smooth her son's hair, pride and sadness mixing in her expression. Has been asking a lot of questions about growing up lately, she explained to Isabella. He wants to understand how to be a good man like his father was. The weight of this responsibility, raising a son to embody the values of a father he could barely remember, was not lost on Isabella. She began to understand the courage it had taken to uproot their lives and move across the country, seeking opportunities that would help her fulfill that responsibility. It must be scary, Isabella said too, making such big decisions when someone else's future depends on them. Terrifying, agreed. But you know what I realized? Being scared of making the wrong decision was keeping me from making any decision at all, and teaching that fear should control your choices seemed like the worst lesson I could give him. Isabella absorbed this wisdom, thinking about her own paralysis in the face of her father's ultimatum. She had been so focused on avoiding conflict and protecting others from potential consequences that she had stopped considering what message her capitulation would send, not just to Tommy, but to herself about her own worth and autonomy. Can I ask you something? Isabella said too. What would you do if someone told you that you couldn't be friends with someone you really liked? Considered this question with the seriousness he brought to all important matters. I would ask why, he said finally, and if their reason wasn't good, I would keep being friends anyway. What if they threatened to hurt your friend if you didn't stop being friends with them? His face scrunched up in concentration. This was clearly a more complex scenario than he had initially anticipated. I think, he said slowly, I would tell my friend about the threat so we could figure out what to do together, because friends help each other with problems. The simplicity of this response struck Isabella with powerful clarity. Throughout her crisis with her father, she had been trying to protect Tommy by handling the situation alone, making decisions about their relationship without including him in the process. She had assumed that shielding him from her father's threats was an act of love, but childlike wisdom suggested it might actually be a form of control, deciding unilaterally what was best for another person rather than trusting them to participate in decisions that affected their own life. You're right, Isabella said too. Friends should help each other with problems. Are you going to tell your friend about your problem? Asked. Isabella realized that she hadn't spoken to Tommy since receiving her father's ultimatum. She had been so overwhelmed by shame and fear that she had simply fled, leaving him to wonder what had happened and why she had suddenly become unreachable. The thought of his confusion and worry added another layer of regret to her already complicated emotions. I think I should, Isabella admitted. I think I've been trying so hard to protect him that I forgot to include him. Watched this exchange with growing admiration for both Isabella's willingness to learn and her son's intuitive understanding of healthy relationships. Had grown up watching his mother navigate single parenthood with integrity and courage, and those lessons were clearly shaping his own understanding of how people should treat each other. As the flight progressed, Isabella found herself sharing more details about her life with Tommy, describing their conversations about art and literature, his passion for developing technology that could help address climate change, and the way he had encouraged her to think about using her family's resources for causes she genuinely cared about rather than simply maintaining wealth for its own sake. He sounds like someone who sees possibilities in you that maybe you haven't seen in yourself, observed. Yes, Isabella said, her voice filled with emotion. He talks about the future like I could be part of creating something meaningful, not just inheriting something that already exists. When I'm with him, I feel like I could become someone I actually respect. And what does your father see when he looks at your relationship with Tommy? Asked. Isabella's expression darkened. Competition, threat, a loss of control over family assets and business strategy. He doesn't see Tommy as a person, just as a representative of rival interests. had been listening to this conversation while playing quietly with his action figure, but now he looked up with a puzzled expression. Why does Isabella's daddy get to choose who she's friends with? She's grown up. The question, asked with a child's assumption that grown-ups should be allowed to make their own decisions, highlighted the fundamental absurdity of Isabella's situation. At 22, she was legally an adult, yet she was still operating under systems of control that treated her as if she were incapable of making sound decisions about her own life. That's a very good question, said carefully. Sometimes families have complicated relationships where love and control get mixed up together. That doesn't sound like love, said definitively. Love is supposed to make you happy, not scared. Isabella felt tears forming again, but this time they were not entirely tears of sadness. His clear understanding of what healthy love looked like forced her to examine her own family dynamics with uncomfortable honesty. Her father's version of love came with extensive conditions and expectations, requiring her to subordinate her own needs and desires to his vision of what was best for the family business. Tommy's approach to their relationship was entirely different. He asked questions about her thoughts and feelings, supported her interests even when they had nothing to do with business, and encouraged her to develop her own opinions and goals. The contrast was stark enough to make her wonder why she had spent so many years accepting her father's conditional affection as normal. Isabella said gently, "What if someone you loved was in a situation where standing up for them might get you in trouble?" "I would stand up for them anyway," replied without hesitation, "because that's what love means." Again, the child's moral clarity cut through adult complexity to identify essential truth. Isabella realized that her fear of her father's retaliation was not just about protecting Tommy. It was about protecting herself from the consequences of asserting her independence. But as had just demonstrated, real love required courage, even when that courage came with costs. Could see that Isabella was processing these insights in real time, her understanding of her situation shifting with each exchange. As a nurse, had observed many patients reach turning points in their healing, moments when they stopped being victims of their circumstances and started becoming active agents in their own recovery. Isabella seemed to be approaching such a moment. "Can I share something with you that might sound presumptuous?" asked. Isabella nodded, having come to trust's perspective over the course of their conversation. "I think you're stronger than you believe you are," said. "And I think your father's threats work because he's counting on you to believe you're powerless. But you're not powerless. You're just operating in a system that benefits from you thinking you are." "But he does have real power," Isabella protested. "He could destroy Tommy's career, ruin his family's business, make him unemployable in the industry." "He could try to do those things," agreed. "But success isn't guaranteed, especially if Tommy and his family are prepared to respond strategically instead of just reacting defensively. Your father's power is significant, but it's not absolute." Isabella had never considered this possibility. In her world, business decisions were rarely questioned or successfully opposed, but was suggesting that this might be because he typically chose battles where his advantages were overwhelming, not because he was invincible in all circumstances. "What do you mean by responding strategically?" Isabella asked. "Well," said thoughtfully, "your father is threatening Tommy's professional reputation and business prospects. But what if Tommy's response isn't to try to avoid that conflict, but to change the context in which it happens? What if instead of hiding your relationship or ending it, you both go public with it in a way that makes your father's retaliation look petty and vindictive?" Isabella stared at, her mind racing through the implications of this approach. She had been thinking defensively, trying to minimize damage and avoid confrontation, but was suggesting an offensive strategy that could potentially turn her father's bullying tactics into a public relations problem for him. "You mean like an announcement that we're together and serious about our relationship?" Isabella asked. "I mean like taking control of the narrative," replied. "Instead of letting your father frame this as a business rivalry, you frame it as a love story between two young people whose families have different business interests. Instead of hiding and hopping he won't follow through on his threats, you make it clear that any retaliation against Tommy will be public knowledge and will reflect poorly on your father's character." Looked up from his toy, having followed this conversation with interest despite its adult complexity. "Like when bullies pick on people at school," he said. If you tell the teacher and other kids about what they're doing, they usually stop because they don't want everyone to know they're being mean. Isabella laughed despite herself, amazed at how this child continued to reduce complex adult situations to clear moral principles. But his analogy was actually quite apt. Her father was essentially bullying Tommy through threats of economic retaliation, counting on secrecy and shame to make his tactics effective. But what if going public just makes him angrier and more determined to follow through? Isabella asked. What if it does? Countered. Are you going to spend your entire life making decisions based on managing your father's anger? What kind of life is that for you, and what kind of relationship can you have with Tommy if it's built on hiding and fear? The question forced Isabella to confront the long-term implications of her current approach. Even if she could somehow navigate this specific crisis, what about the next time her personal choices conflicted with her father's business interests? Would she spend decades subordinating her own happiness to avoid triggering his displeasure? I've never him before, Isabella admitted quietly. Not about anything important. Which probably makes this feel more frightening than it actually is, observed. You don't know what will happen because you've never tested the boundaries, but you also don't know how much of his control over your life depends on your cooperation rather than his actual power. As the plane began its descent toward Los Angeles, Isabella felt something changing inside her chest, a loosening of the tight anxiety that had characterized her breathing for days, replaced by something that felt almost like excitement. For the first time since receiving her father's ultimatum, she was beginning to see possibilities beyond the limited options he had presented to her. But she was also beginning to understand that choosing courage over fear would, as the aircraft began its final descent into Los Angeles International Airport. Isabella felt the familiar flutter of nervous anticipation that came with landing. But this time, it was amplified by the realization that she was about to face the consequences of her impulsive decision to flee. The conversation with and had shifted something fundamental in her understanding of her situation. But having new perspective and knowing how to act on it were entirely different challenges. I need to call Tommy, Isabella said suddenly, reaching for her phone before remembering they were still in airplane mode. I need to tell him what's been happening and find out if he's willing to face this together. Nodded approvingly. That's the first step toward treating him like an equal partner rather than someone who needs to be protected from difficult truths. But what if he decides the risk isn't worth it? Isabella asked, voicing a fear she had been trying not to acknowledge. What if when he understands what my father is capable of, he decides it's better to end things cleanly rather than fight a battle he might not win? Looked up from his coloring book, which he had returned to as the adult conversation had grown more complex. If he decides that, then he's not really your friend, he said with the matter-of-fact wisdom that had characterized all his contributions to their discussion. Is right, agreed. If Tommy isn't willing to stand with you when things get difficult, then you're better off finding out now rather than building a relationship on the assumption that he'll be there when you need him. Isabella absorbed this perspective, recognizing the truth in it even as it made her nervous. She had been so focused on protecting Tommy from her father's threats that she hadn't considered whether their relationship was strong enough to withstand external pressure. If it wasn't, then perhaps her father's interference was revealing a weakness that would have become apparent eventually anyway. As the plane touched down and began taxiing toward the gate, Isabella made a decision that surprised herself with its clarity and firmness. I'm going to call Tommy as soon as we get off the plane, she announced. I'm going to tell him everything about my father's threats, about my fears, about what happened to make me run away without explaining anything. And then I'm going to ask him if he wants to face this situation together or if he thinks we should end things to avoid the conflict. And if he wants to face it together, asked. Then we figure out how to do this in a way that doesn't let my father define the terms of engagement, Isabella replied, using earlier language. We take control of the narrative and make it clear that any retaliation will be public and will reflect poorly on him. And if he doesn't want to face it together? Isabella was quiet for a moment, considering this possibility honestly. Then I'll know that what I thought we had wasn't real, and I'll move forward with my life knowing that I was brave enough to find out the truth. Smiled with genuine pride. Over the course of their flight, she had watched Isabella transform from someone who was paralyzed by fear and uncertainty into someone who was prepared to take responsibility for her choices and their consequences. It was a transformation had seen in some of her strongest patients, the moment when they stopped being victims of their circumstances and started being active agents in their own healing. As passengers began gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark, tugged on Isabella's sleeve to get her attention. "Are you still sad?" he asked. Isabella considered the question seriously. She was still nervous about the conversation she needed to have with Tommy, still worried about the potential consequences of defying her father, still uncertain about how everything would work out. But the crushing weight of hopelessness that had characterized her emotional state when the flight began had lifted significantly. "I'm still scared," she told honestly. "But I'm not sad in the same way anymore. I think I'm scared about something I'm choosing to do rather than scared about things that are happening to me." Nodded as if this distinction made perfect sense to him. "Being scared about your own choices is better than being scared about other people's choices," he said sagely. Isabella laughed, marveling again at this child's ability to distill complex emotional truths into simple statements. "You're absolutely right about that," she agreed. As they made their way off the plane, Isabella exchanged contact information with, promising to update her about how the situation with Tommy resolved. There was something about their connection that felt too significant to end with the flight, and had expressed genuine interest in knowing how Isabella's story continued. "Thank you," Isabella said, as they prepared to part ways in the terminal. "I know you didn't have to get involved in a stranger's problems, but I'm grateful that you did." "Sometimes the people who need us most are strangers," replied. "And sometimes helping someone else is exactly what we need to do for ourselves." Isabella understood that his willingness to offer comfort and wisdom had been as much about her own values and sense of purpose as it had been about Isabella's specific needs. By reaching out to help someone in distress, had been acting in accordance with principles that defined who she wanted to be in the world. As Isabella watched and disappear into the crowd of travelers, she felt a profound sense of gratitude not just for their help, but for the reminder that kindness and courage were choices available to anyone, regardless of their circumstances or background. His decision to cross social boundaries and offer support to a stranger had been an act of moral leadership that had nothing to do with wealth or status and everything to do with character. Standing alone in the busy terminal, Isabella pulled out her phone and turned it back on, watching as messages and missed calls began loading. Most were from her father, her mother, and various family assistants, all increasingly frantic about her sudden disappearance. But there were also several messages from Tommy, progressing from confusion to worry to hurt as her silence extended without explanation. Reading his messages, Isabella could see the pain she had caused by simply vanishing without communication. His texts moved from "Hey, everything okay?" to "Really worried about you, please call," to "I don't know what happened, but I'm here if you need me," to "Finally, I hope you're safe. I'll be here when you're ready to talk." The progression of his messages told a story of someone who cared deeply, but was being shut out without explanation. Instead of becoming angry or demanding, Tommy had remained supportive and patient, which made Isabella's heart ache with regret for having put him through this worry unnecessarily. She found a quiet corner of the terminal and dialed his number, her heart racing as she waited for him to answer. "Isabella," his voice was filled with relief and concern. "Thank God you're okay. I've been worried sick." "I'm so sorry," Isabella said immediately. "I should have called you, should have explained what was happening. I was scared and I panicked, and I handled everything in the worst possible way." "Where are you? What happened?" Tommy's voice was gentle but urgent. "I'm in Lowe's Angels," Isabella said. "I ran away after my father threatened to destroy your career if I didn't stop seeing you." There was silence on the other end of the line for several seconds. When Tommy spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. "He what?" Isabella explained the entire situation, her father's ultimatum, his threats against Tommy's professional future, her fear that continuing their relationship would result in devastating consequences for him. She spoke rapidly, trying to get all the information out before her courage faltered. When she finished, Tommy was quiet for a long moment. "Isabella," he said finally, "I need you to understand something. You don't get to make unilateral decisions about my life to protect me from consequences I'm perfectly capable of evaluating and accepting myself." The statement was delivered without anger, but it was firm and clear. Isabella realized that her attempt to shield Tommy from her father's threats had actually been a form of disrespect, treating him as if he were incapable of making informed decisions about his own risks and priorities. "You're right," she admitted. "I was so focused on trying to protect you that I forgot to treat you like an equal partner who deserved to know what we were dealing with." "I appreciate the intention," Tommy said, his voice warming slightly. "But I need to know that if we're going to build something together, you trust me enough to face problems together rather than trying to solve them alone." "I do," Isabella said firmly. "I want to face this together. I want to figure out how to handle my father's threats in a way that doesn't let him control our choices through intimidation." "Good," Tommy replied, "because I've been thinking about this situation since your father's people contacted my family yesterday, and I have some ideas about how we might approach this differently than he's expecting." Isabella felt a surge of hope and excitement. "He contacted your family." "Apparently he thought applying pressure through my parents might be more effective than limiting himself to threats against me personally," Tommy explained. "But what he didn't anticipate is that my family has been dealing with business rivalry and competitive pressure for decades. We're not nearly as vulnerable to his tactics as he assumed we would be." For the first time since this crisis began, Isabella felt like she and Tommy were on the same team, facing a challenge together rather than being pulled apart by it. The relief was enormous, but it was accompanied by a new kind of nervousness, the anxiety of not knowing what they were walking into, balanced against the confidence that came from not having to face it alone. "What kind of ideas?" she asked. "The kind that require us to be brave enough to bet on each other and smart enough to play this game better than your father is playing it," Tommy replied. "But first, I need to know, are you ready to stop running and start fighting for what we want?" Isabella thought about simple wisdom about standing up for people you cared about courage in creating a new life for her family, about the difference between being scared about your own choices versus being scared about other people's choices. 3 weeks later, Isabella sat in a coffee shop near Columbia University, scrolling through news articles on her tablet while waiting for Tommy to finish his meeting with a potential investor. The headlines told a story that would have seemed impossible to her just a month earlier, but which now felt like the inevitable result of choosing courage over comfort. "Heir goes public with romance, challenges family business empire." "Young love versus corporate dynasty, the Isabella story." "Tech rivals children unite, defy family business pressure." The media attention had been intense, but largely sympathetic, painting Isabella and Tommy as young people whose genuine affection was being threatened by outdated business rivalries and corporate control. The narrative that had emerged was exactly what had suggested, a love story that made her father's threats look petty and vindictive rather than strategically sound. Isabella's phone buzzed with a text message from, who had become a regular source of encouragement and perspective, as Isabella navigated the aftermath of her decision to stand up to her father. "Saw the interview you and Tommy did on CNN this morning. You both looked confident and happy. How are you holding up?" Isabella smiled as she typed her response. The interview had been Tommy's idea, a way of controlling their narrative while addressing the rumors and speculation that had been circulating in business and social media circles since their relationship became public knowledge. "Feeling good, Dad's threats haven't materialized the way he expected. Turns out publicly threatening young people in love doesn't play well in the press." It was true. His initial response to their public announcement had been swift and harsh, just as Isabella had feared. He had attempted to follow through on his threats against Tommy's family business, using his influence to create problems with investors and business partners. But the media attention around the situation had made his retaliation transparent and public, generating negative publicity for industries and sympathy for the family. More importantly, Tommy's family had been prepared for the assault. Instead of trying to weather the storm quietly, they had documented every instance of interference and pressure, building a case that portrayed as a bully using his economic power to control his adult daughter's personal relationships. The turning point had come when 3 major business publications ran editorial pieces criticizing his tactics, questioning whether someone who would use corporate resources for personal vendettas could be trusted with fiduciary responsibility to shareholders and partners. The reputational damage to industries had been swift and significant, forcing to reconsider his approach. Isabella's phone rang, and she saw Tommy's number on the display. "How did the meeting go?" she asked by way of greeting. "Better than expected," Tommy replied, and she could hear the excitement in his voice. "Not only are they interested in funding our climate technology project, but they specifically mentioned that they were impressed by how we handled the pressure from your father. Apparently, standing up to bullying is good for business credibility." Isabella laughed, remembering her father's prediction that defying him would destroy both their professional reputations. Instead, their willingness to face his intimidation tactics had generated respect and support from people who valued integrity over expedience. "Any word from your parents about the board meeting?" Isabella asked. "They're confident," Tommy said. "The documentation we provided about your father's interference tactics has the board concerned about potential liability issues. Apparently, using corporate resources for personal vendettas opens up all kinds of legal problems they'd rather avoid." This was an aspect of the situation that neither Isabella nor her father had initially considered. By using industry's business relationships and resources to pressure the family, had potentially exposed the company to legal action and regulatory scrutiny. The board of directors, responsible for protecting shareholders' interests, was not pleased to discover that corporate assets were being used to settle family disputes. "I still can't believe how differently this turned out than I expected," Isabella admitted. "That's because you were thinking like someone who had always been controlled by his threats," Tommy replied gently. "Once you started thinking like someone with your own power and resources, completely different options became visible." Isabella reflected on this insight as she watched students walking across the campus courtyard outside the coffee shop window. She had indeed been operating from a position of assumed powerlessness, focusing on how to minimize damage rather than how to assert her own agency and influence. The transformation had begun with her conversation with and on the airplane, but it had continued as she learned to see herself as someone with her own resources, relationships, and capabilities, rather than simply as an extension of her father's empire. She had her own trust fund, her own social connections, her own educational credentials and business ideas. More importantly, she had her own values and vision for how she wanted to live her life. When she and Tommy had gone public with their relationship and the pressures they were facing, the response had surprised everyone involved. Instead of the scandal and social ostracism her father had predicted, they had received support from friends, business contacts, and even strangers who admired their willingness to choose authentic feeling over strategic calculation. Several other young people from prominent business families had reached out to share their own stories of family pressure to subordinate personal happiness to corporate interests. Isabella had been amazed to discover how common her struggle was, and how many people were quietly dealing with similar conflicts between family expectations and individual autonomy. Tommy arrived at the coffee shop, sliding into the seat across from Isabella with a grin that suggested their latest challenge had been successfully navigated. "The board meeting results?" Isabella asked. "Your father has been strongly advised to cease all interference in our relationship and to issue a public apology for his previous threats," Tommy reported. "If he refuses, they're prepared to remove him from his position as chairman and CEO." Isabella sat back in her chair, absorbing this information. She had hoped that standing up to her father would stop his attempts at control, but she had never imagined that the consequences would reach the level of threatening his position at the company he had built. "How do you feel about that?" Tommy asked, studying her face carefully. Isabella considered the question honestly. A month ago, the thought of her father facing serious professional consequences would have terrified her. But now, having experienced the freedom that came from making her own choices and accepting responsibility for the results, she found that her primary emotion was relief rather than guilt. "I feel like he created this situation by trying to use corporate resources for personal control," she said finally. "And I feel like the board is doing what they're supposed to do, protecting the company's interests and reputation." Her phone buzzed with another message, this time from her mother. Isabella's relationship with her parents had been complicated since she had chosen to stand with Tommy rather than comply with her father's ultimatum, but they had been slowly working toward a new understanding of boundaries and respect. "Your father wants to have dinner this week to discuss the situation. He's ready to accept your relationship with Tommy if you're willing to consider rejoining the family business on different terms." Isabella showed the message to Tommy, who read it with interest but no surprise. "He's adapting to the new reality," Tommy observed, recognizing that he can either have a relationship with you that respects your autonomy or risk losing his relationship with you entirely. Isabella nodded, appreciating how much her father's language had changed from demands and ultimatums to invitations and negotiations. The shift reflected a recognition that she was no longer someone who could be controlled through threats, but rather someone whose cooperation would need to be earned through respect and genuine consideration of her interests. "What are you thinking about the business opportunity?" Tommy asked. Isabella had been surprised to discover that her father's offer to reconsider her role in industries was actually appealing to her, but only because it would be on completely different terms than his previous expectations. Instead of preparing her to simply inherit existing structures and maintain traditional approaches, he was now suggesting that she could lead the company's development of socially responsible investment strategies and environmentally sustainable business practices. "I'm interested," Isabella admitted, "but only if I can do it in partnership with you and your family's company. I want to create something new that reflects both our values and our capabilities, not just maintain something that already exists." Tommy smiled, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I was hoping you'd say that, because I've been working on a proposal for how our companies could collaborate on clean energy projects that could benefit both our families while actually addressing some serious environmental challenges." As they began discussing the possibilities for this collaboration, Isabella felt a deep sense of satisfaction that went beyond the resolution of their immediate crisis. She had discovered that standing up for herself had opened up opportunities and relationships that would never have been possible if she had continued operating from fear and compliance. Her phone rang, and she was delighted to see his number on the display. "How's the new job going?" Isabella asked, remembering that had started working at a children's hospital in Los Angeles. "It's challenging but wonderful," replied. "Loves his new school, and I love feeling like I'm making a difference in a place where my skills are really needed. How are things with you and Tommy?" Isabella gave a brief update on the recent developments, including the board's ultimatum to her father and the potential business collaboration that was emerging from their successful navigation of the crisis. "I'm so proud of you," said warmly. "You found your courage and used it to create exactly the kind of life you wanted to live." "I couldn't have done it without the conversation we had on the airplane," Isabella replied honestly. "You helped me see that I was stronger than I thought I was, and that my choices mattered more than I realized." "You had the strength all along," corrected gently. "You just needed someone to remind you that it was there." After ending the call with, Isabella and Tommy continued planning their evening, which would include a celebration dinner with Tommy's family and a video call with, and to share their good news. The people who had supported them through the crisis had become an extended family of choice, bound together by shared values and mutual respect rather than biology or business necessity. As they walked across campus together, Isabella reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that tearful flight to Los Angeles. She was still wealthy, still connected to powerful business interests, still navigating complex family relationships. But she was doing all of it from a position of personal strength and authentic choice rather than fear and compliance. Most importantly, she had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act according to your values despite being afraid. It was a lesson that, a 7-year-old boy with an action figure and infinite wisdom, had taught her with the simple observation that doing the right thing was often hard, but that difficulty didn't make it any less necessary. Looking at Tommy, who was excitedly explaining his latest ideas for their potential business partnership, Isabella felt profound gratitude for the strange chain of events that had brought them to this point. Sometimes the most important conversations happened with strangers on airplanes, and sometimes the most life-changing wisdom came from children who saw the world with perfect moral clarity. But mostly, she felt grateful that she had finally learned the difference between a life that looked successful from the outside and a life that felt authentic from the inside. The latter, she was discovering, was worth every risk she had taken to achieve it. "Yes," she said with more certainty than she had felt about anything in months. "I'm ready to fight for what we want." "Then get on the next flight back to New York," Tommy said. "We have work to do, her to accept responsibility for consequences she couldn't predict or control." The question was whether the person she wanted to become was worth the risks involved in discovering who that person might be. The question was whether she would have the courage to act on that understanding once the plane landed and the safety of this suspended moment ended. As the plane climbed toward cruising altitude, two women from completely different worlds began a conversation that would challenge everything they thought they knew about family, loyalty, courage, and the price of living authentically in a world that often demanded conformity above all else.